Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Redkis-Schill, a freelance biofuels journalist writing about ethanol and other biofuels for Ethanol Producer Magazine and others. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded before they're lost. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. Our guest today is David Kolsrud, a farmer from Beaver Creek, Minnesota, in the extreme southwest corner of the state. In the 1990s, he worked to get an ethanol plant started in nearby Luverne and went on to help start multiple other farmer cooperatives focused on ethanol. Welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast, David. Tell me, what motivated you to get an ethanol plant built?
Well, thanks for having me, Sue. Basically, I grew up on a farm and I've always was interested in value added and handling our commodities from start to finish. But what got me involved was the fact that the idea of ethanol came up in our hometown of Luverne, and I was asked to come to the meeting and I went to it, and I didn't know anything about it at that time. But when you started meeting with people and other people I didn't really know all that well, and we started figuring out if we worked together, we could do better than if we were doing it individually. And so I ended up being the leader of the group and started putting it together back in 1995. And I guess what motivated me more than anything was trying to make it on your own back in those days, right after the farm crisis of the 80s and everything. It was difficult living on the farm. And I thought, if we work together with our friends and neighbors and community, we can actually make products and make more money and more jobs and opportunities for our young people.
You were pretty interested in the cooperative model, and I think that's something that people maybe could learn a bit more about why cooperatives were a big part of this ethanol movement in those early days.
Exactly. The fact that farmers grow the commodities, there were some people doing this already, like American Crystal Sugar and Minnesota Corn Processors, where they would commit their commodities and cash and build their facilities. And feedstock's a big part of the cost of running these facilities. Well, the farmers already had the feedstock, and then if they commit them, and basically what happens is you add value to them, and then the profits are distributed pro rata by the investors going back. And basically the co-op movement reduces a lot of risk in these projects, and I have been a very big proponent of that, and we've done a lot of talks and stuff on cooperatives. And some of the interesting cooperatives are like Ocean Spray Cranberries and Ace Hardware. Of all things, there's co-ops in our backyard we don't even know that are value-added co-ops. And so I've been very adamant about rather than trying to make it on your own, to work with friends and neighbors.
Were farmers pretty supportive of this back at the beginning? Because this was like brand new in Minnesota, I understand, in the mid-90s.
The answer to that is no. They were somewhat supportive, but they were not used to working together. I mean, it was difficult. When we did our original meeting in Luverne, and everybody walked out of it saying, I don't know why I'd want to be a part of that. That's, why would I do that? So then we held the second meeting, and that even went worse, and nothing went right. And then I visited with the economic development director of the county at that time, and I said, is there one of these plants running? And they said, well, yeah. I think we're doing it wrong. Let's get a bus and go tour a facility. And once we did that, then everybody said, wow, I didn't know we could do that. They just had no idea how big it could be and how much of an influence it had. Then after that, then the momentum started to build. So seeing was believing.
Seeing was believing. Yeah. Well, how much money did you raise, and were you able to? And how did you go about getting the farmers involved in that?
Well, this is very interesting. We were so early on, we thought we just went out and asked people for money. And we did that for a year. And we were sitting in a meeting, and one of the members or attendees at the meeting said, "Oh, where's your prospectus?" And I said, "Oh, what's a prospectus?" And well, you can't just raise money unless you have the legal entity and this and that. And I said, "Well, we're just a bunch of farmers trying to build something." I found out that we needed to have all the legal work done. And that's how early we were. So we went and found some co-op attorneys out of Minneapolis and did a rescission offer. Everybody got offered their money back. We did all the legal work and put everything together. And then we had the prospectus, and we ended up raising a significant amount of money, but not enough to build the ethanol plant itself. And so then we had to get innovative on our financing and creativity. And the city of Luverne was extremely helpful. And believe it or not, the city of Luverne gave us $1 million cash up front for TIF. And then they also did a $1 million personal guarantee. And then we found a bank that said, well, we'll finance you with lower equity, but we need more participants. Well, then the builder, who was Fagan at that time, he invested in a plant, and he did a personal guarantee. And then Drawing and Associates, which later became Poet, they were managing and the engineers of the company, and they also did a personal guarantee to help get it going. And so a small private group of investors that put some money in. And so we ended up being a hybrid model of all things. We had farmers, and we had commitments by the builder and the city and some private individuals to finally reach the finish line. So it was difficult, but it turned out to be very successful.
You told me that there was a really low point in all of this, and your daughter Jill had quite an influence on you. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, Sue, it's kind of touching because I was working on putting the project together, and nobody gets paid for these things back then, and we've been at it for almost 2 years, and we raised $3.5 million on a $9 million project. It was a $20 million project, but we needed half of it in equity, and the board of directors. We had a small board, and we were all friends, and they said, we've been at this 2 years, David. We're going to send the money back. We're not going to make it. And I said, oh, man, I put my whole life into this. I'm struggling on the farm. I don't know what we're going to do. And so I said, give me a week to decompress. So I went home, and 3 days later, my attorney from the city's called and said, David, hug the wife and kiss the kids, or kiss the kids and hug the wife. But as a friend, you have to let go. It's over. And I was hysterical, and I was crying. My wife was crying, and, we lost everything. And I have a 14-year-old daughter, maybe 13 at the time, 14. And she's an artist, and she was on the floor painting rocks with lake scenes on it. And she started mumbling something, and she mumbled it again and again, and I was just, devastated with the news that this was finally over. And I finally leaned down and I said, Jill, what did you say? She said, Dad, it won't fail. There are too many good people. You just haven't met them yet. And I thought, wow, what an inspiration. And I went out with a different attitude, and we found some key people in the next couple of days, and 6 months later, we were under construction. So it was a very touching moment. And then, quite honestly, out of the voice of a child, had more faith in the project than anybody. And so even to this day, I almost cry when I think about it.
I bet. Yeah, I bet. Well, that story you ended up telling to a lot of people, because you ended up being traveling around and talking about ethanol. What all was that about?
Well, it was kind of I was never considered myself a public speaker or anything, but I was up in Windsor, Ontario, Canada for an ethanol conference. And I think it was probably sponsored by BBI back then. And Mike Bryan, who founded BBI, had a session on what it takes to get an ethanol plant started. And it was a full house. And I went in there and wondering, well, who's talking or what's going on? And to my astonishment, Mike Bryan introduced me as the speaker. And I'm like, oh, now what do I do? And so I got up there and I just started telling stories. And I told the story about my daughter and the dad, it won't fail. There are too many good people. And that was very influential among several people in the audience. And that actually helped me or helped the industry. I mean, what happened was that I was asked to speak at a lot of events after that and telling stories and what it takes to get an ethanol plant going.
Were there a lot of farmer groups that were interested but just needed a little bit of boost, or did you actually help them financially?
No, I think it was more about, it was so early on that most of the people didn't really know anything about it. And it was farmers groups that needed, they were curious more than anything. And I would, coming in speaking in would have a template, basically 30 steps from conception to completion and what you needed to do. And, just the basic ideas of getting a steering committee and writing a mission statement and stuff like that. And that's what we ended up going around doing a lot of public speaking on. And I basically put together a rather humorous but a rather unique speech called Priming the Pump in Rural America. And that was what we put together, and it talked about some silly ideas, some not so silly, but it was very riveting with the people, and they still remember it to this day. I mean, we even had one slide in there where I said, I was specializing in dancing pigs, but we never really made any money at it. But there was an animation of a whole bunch of dancing pigs. And so that presentation was done many times in the U.S., almost in every state, and I did it in Canada and Argentina too, just talking about priming the pump in rural America or wherever we're at. So, yeah.
So how important was it to the farm economy, these plants? I mean, what was going on? You were a farmer, and people know that the 70s and 80s were really awful, but the 90s were still tough for farming. And I gather that it was actually kind of tough for small towns as well.
It was extremely tough on rural America, small towns. The young people were leaving, commodities were going by train. What was happening was once you started getting a project going in your hometown, even when it's under construction, every Sunday after church, everybody would have to drive by it and see how it was going. A lot of the farm kids applied for jobs there because basically we needed a lot of operators. We needed maintenance people. We needed to hire 25 people, and most of them all come out of the community. Even in Luverne, a big meat packing plant closed down the same time as we were starting. And so all the maintenance people that were at the packing plant were able to stay in Luverne, and they all worked at the ethanol plant. And that wasn't just Luverne, but this is town after town after town, creating opportunities. And even just the fact that the distiller's feed that we were producing was going for livestock feed and everything else. And the livestock industry started thriving because they had another protein source. So I think it mushroomed beyond our wildest expectations, that even far exceeded that.
I understand that farmers in Iowa weren't too excited about ethanol. And that's something to do with the feed side?
Yeah, that was interesting because we had the Minnesota model and we had advocated for that. Minnesota did quite well, and we had several ethanol plants, and then there were other states that were looking at it, and Governor Vilsack was governor of Iowa at that time, but they had certain senators and legislators in there that were, Iowa's a big cattle hog feeding state, and they didn't want the price of corn to go up. So they didn't really want anything to do with ethanol because they didn't want the price of corn to go up. And so Iowa never really took off right away. And then all of a sudden, right after the turn of the century there, then when ethanol started taking off, well, then Iowa just finally said, well, this is a good idea. You can build them and we'll permit them after they're built. So Iowa went from not having hardly any ethanol interest to being I think currently the leader in the ethanol industry.
Oh, by a long shot, they have the most ethanol production of all states. California had a big part in ethanol taking off as well. And in MTBE, the oxygenate that the oil companies preferred the oxygenate because, well, it came from petroleum and they could control it. They didn't particularly like ethanol. But you had some involvement with getting California on board with ethanol too, right?
So it's really a unique experience. I was sitting in the plant in Luverne, and a phone rang one day, and it was Pat Perez with the California Energy Commission, and he said, we're doing a survey because we want to make sure there's enough ethanol to supply California. And I said, well, we're making 20 million gallons. He said, thank you. And I said, oh, wait a minute, why did you call me? We're a farmer-owned plant. He goes, well, what do you mean by farmer-owned plant? And I said, well, just exactly what I said. He said, oh, I thought all the ethanol come out of like Cargill or ADM. I said, no, there's the Minnesota model as farmers that own plants and production. And would you come out to California and talk to the California Energy Commission about this model? And I said, sure. So I went out there, and they didn't have a lot of time, but I talked to them for a couple hours, and they were intrigued. And then little did you know, the phone rang about 3 weeks later and said, the California Energy Commission wants to come visit the plant in Luverne, Minnesota. But only one rule, no press. And this was in September of 2001. And it was really interesting also is, they're used to staying in better hotels and you're right there by South Dakota. Could you send a picture of the hotel or motel before they come? And I said, well, yeah, sure. And so I went to Sioux Falls. We put them up at, I think it's the Hilton over there, or whatever it's connected to. President Bush at that time stayed there a week before that. So I said, it was good enough for him, might be good enough for you. And they called and apologized. But make a long story short, the California Energy Commission was very interested in the farmer-owned model. They showed up in Sioux Falls and Luverne, and that was a week that the Twin Towers come down. And so we had the whole California Energy Commission at our plant for 3-4 days. We took them out to farms, and they drove farm machinery. They toured the plant. We even put a bunch of bales in the machine shed, had a big meal catered in, and they still talk about it to this day. And we couldn't get them out of there. We couldn't get Jerry Brown's plane out of California. We had no way to move them. And then finally, after 3 days, they did go visit the Corn Palace in Mitchell, and they were disappointed in that. But anyway, so that was very interesting. Finally, they chartered a bus and started heading back to California. But that was a big turning point for the ethanol industry, because the idea of community-owned, farmer-owned ethanol plants was something California really, really bought into.
Ah, okay. So that made them feel better about ethanol being used in California. Interesting. Interesting.
Yes, it was a big turning point, and they've been some of our biggest advocates, at that time. And well, of course, that was in 2001, and then we had the ethanol boom right after that. So
yeah. Well, California was the first to ban MTBE because it was discovered there that it was contaminating groundwater. So, David, do you have any favorite stories from some of the other plants that you were involved in getting started? Like I understand you were involved with one in Wisconsin?
Yeah, that's correct. So Badger State Ethanol in Monroe, Wisconsin is a very unique plant because up until this time, we had the Minnesota model where farmers would commit cash and commodities, and they wanted to be the first limited liability company that actually did not require a corn delivery agreement. And so they had to put together all of the offering documents and everything there. And so, two things that were interesting about Badger State was they introduced, well, we introduced them when they were familiar with Ron Fagan of Fagan Inc. that was building, some of the farmer-owned plants, and it was early on. And they, John Milsheen and Gary Kramer, had Ron Fagan look at a site and said, we want a 40 million gallon plant. We don't want corn deliveries. What's it going to cost to build it? So Ron Fagan goes, and he kind of hawed around, and they said, no, we want to know what it costs. And he basically took a napkin and wrote down, well, this is what we will do, and this is what it'll cost. And that napkin ended up being the contract that built probably the next 50 ethanol plants off of that. That was the EPC contract written on the back of a napkin, signed by Ron Fagan and Gary Kramer and John Milsheen. So
That's kind of crazy.
yeah,
That's kind of crazy. Any other stories from other plants and other communities that illustrate this farmer side, the farmer involvement?
I think we had some great friends on the farmer side with corn growers associations because they were looking for a better price for corn. And somebody I never knew until later in life was president of the National Corn Growers in 1999. And basically, the ethanol industry was getting a 5.4 cent credit on the taxes at the pump. And that legislation came up in 1999 as to repeal it. And the ethanol industry would probably collapse if they didn't have that at that time. And so the National Corn Growers was working really hard to maintain that credit. And it ended up being a tie vote in the Senate, 49 to save ethanol, 49 to do away with ethanol. And Al Gore was vice president then, and Ryland Outlaut, who later went on to be chairman of the board at Mid-Missouri Energy in Malta Bend, Missouri, was president of the National Corn Growers. And he convinced Al Gore to come back and break the tie in favor of ethanol. And that was in 1999, or else the industry probably would have withered and died.
Wow.
So we're here, but there was a lot of people that stepped up to the plate at the right time.
Yeah. And it's had an impact on rural communities. Do you remember what impact it had at Luverne? Did it increase the farmer's bottom line by a whole lot, or did that take time?
Actually, it went quicker than you would expect. We were not only paying a better price for the corn, but we were paying, a little premiums and stuff for the ethanol plant. We started making money, and we were pretty big on returning dividends back to our farmers. And the economic activity took off a lot quicker than I expected it to, and everything started kind of turning around. The implement business started doing better. People were looking for jobs there. We actually, what's quite interesting, we were returning back to the farmers almost 100% return on investment every year. So,
oh my,
yeah, which is unbelievable. And a lot of it had to do with our timing and where we were, but we did that consecutively for 14 years in a row. We ended up averaging well over 100% return. And so the dividends going back to the people, and then they found, working together really was a pretty good way to go. And then some of them went on to invest in other startup ethanol plants. And We couldn't expand the Luverne facility because we only had a big enough gas line coming into the area for a plant that was only 20 million gallons. So a lot of people in our early investors, they would invest like in Badger State Ethanol in Monroe, Wisconsin, or a lot of them invested in Husker Ag in Plainview, Nebraska. So they were investing in other facilities, and they were getting value-added payments back out of these other locations.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that explains why Laverne continued to be a small plant. It was more of, and that must have been a lesson for everybody, was that, whoa, natural gas supply is one of those limiting factors. We have to be sure we can get enough as people are looking to site new facilities.
Well, there was three things you look for. It was rail and natural gas and corn. And we were limited on the natural gas. So you're right on that. But the original Minnesota model was even a little bit more broad-based. We used to draw a circle around the plant, 25 miles in all directions. So it was a 50-mile circle. And the idea was to only take 1/3 of the corn in that circle. And then 1/3 went to ethanol, 1/3 went to exports, and 1/3 went to livestock feed. That was the original Minnesota model. And then as the ethanol need for more ethanol came, then the plants got bigger, and then the models changed to more corn and more gas and more rail. And then it even expanded into, you needed to have unit trains to move the product down.
Yes, unit trains are 108 cars, I think, for the big ones. Maybe, I think they started out smaller, but now they're up to around 100, over 100 cars. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, they're big. They're long. So yeah.
They're long, yeah. Interesting how that all came in. But when you built Luverne, that 20 million gallon a year plant was a big plant.
It was, yeah. That was, they all were that size, and then it wasn't until Badger went to 40 million gallons in Monroe, Wisconsin, and then Wentworth, South Dakota was the other 40 million gallon plant. But up to that time, they were all small facilities.
Okay. So where did your product go back in the 90s? Where did your ethanol go?
That was back then. It was interesting, Sue, that Denver, Colorado was having quite a issue with that dome of smog over the city. And when we first opened up Luverne, all of our ethanol went to Denver. That was part of the solution for cleaning up the air. And that was the biggest selling point for ethanol to begin with, was the clean air side of the product. And we started off in going to Denver, Colorado, and then after that, Las Vegas was a massive user of ethanol after that, just to get rid of the smog issues. So that was the clean air side of the ethanol was what really drove it at the beginning.
So do you have any, as we come to a close and on our time, do you have any advice for the next generation? I mean, you were involved in getting something started from the bootstrap, from the very beginning, but now we have a bunch of people that are looking at new opportunities to turn ethanol into sustainable aviation fuel or do other new things and other new fuels. You have any advice?
Yeah, I think a couple of things on that is number one is the only model we had in ethanol for several years was to make more of the same cheaper. And now fast forward, we have more of the same cheaper. We need to expand our usage because we have all these modern facilities. So there's a couple of things that are pretty significant going forward. One is sustainable aviation fuel, it's alcohol to jet. We're seeing that being explored with Gevo and some of the other companies that are moving forward in the aviation side. We're also we're working with a company called Cap CO2, where we're taking carbon dioxide off the ethanol plant and converting it into green methanol, which is the fuel of choice for these big cargo ships. So we're seeing a lot of innovation going in that direction. And matter of fact, our original Luverne facility, which was used by Gevo for isobutanol, we're looking at partnering with them or buying it from them to start doing innovation in that facility. And the green methanol is one of the first things we're going to be doing.
Interesting. Do you think the level of risk people are taking today, or is anywhere close to the level of risk you guys took in those 1990s?
No.
Can you make a comparison?
No. Back in those days, we were all so broke we had nothing to lose. We had one young man that he was farming. He got to the point where he didn't really care anymore because he was just struggling, and so he applied for some of those credit cards where you get $5,000. He applied for 2 or 3 of them and put the $15,000 in the ethanol plant, and it wasn't very smart, but it turned out he got a pretty big return on investment rather quickly. Today the difference is most of us have enough assets, we have something to lose, and so we're a lot more careful or prudent about our investment. But in those days, they just come out of the 70s and 80s, and they knew they had to do something different. So the level of investing and the risks they took, whether it was the farmers or the builders or the contractors, it was amazing the amount of risks they took to as a foundation to get this industry going.
I guess it was the vision that they had.
And passion.
Yeah. Well, those are the stories I hope to capture, and I appreciate you taking the time to visit with me and with our listeners of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you, Sue.
Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarski, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka-Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.